Okay, I think we'll make a start. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Jason Reeves. I'm the head of policy and comms at CIEEM. Welcome to this, the 7th episode of our Sector Streams webinar series. Today's theme is environmental net gain. For information, September's Sector Streams webinar will be on looking to the future and to the next generation of ecologists and environmental managers. So Sector Streams is our monthly topical discussion panel. Previous episodes are on our YouTube channel and on the Resource Hub, so you can find them on the CIEEM website. And we'll be recording today's episode as well, so that'll go up in the next couple of days as well, so you can go and find it there as well. So on to today's theme, environmental net gain. It's a follow-on from us publishing a briefing and a set of principles on this topic. The briefing basically explains the background, what it is, how it could apply, and then the principles is on effective delivery. Both of those documents are freely available on the CIEEM website. If you go to the Resource Hub and you select environmental net gain under topics, they will both appear for you. So today we have an illustrious panel. We'll take questions from the audience as well. So if you can use the Q&A function, put any questions in there, we will take those. So to today's panel. We've got Martina Gervin from Arcadis, Claire Wansbury from Atkins, and Steph Ray from Nature Positive. I'll get them each to quickly introduce themselves. Martina.
Hi everybody, a real pleasure to be here. At the moment I'm heading up the ecology team and the arboricultural team for Arcadis, but my passion for a very long time has been in biodiversity and ecosystem services, and I'm making those available and those benefits available for people and for nature.
Thank you. Claire.
Hello, I'm Claire Wansbury. I'm an Associate Director in the Ecology Practice within Atkins, and I'm also Atkins Technical Authority on Biodiversity and Natural Capital.
Thank you. And Steph.
Hi there, I'm Steph Ray. I'm very happy to join this. Jason described it as illustrious, but also notably all-female panel, and really looking forward to the day when that's something not worth commenting on. I'm the founder and director of a practice called Nature Positive, and we look at the impacts of businesses on the natural environment.
Thanks very much, Steph. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, pop those in the Q&A and we will come to those. Moving on to some questions then for the panel. So if we start off, Martina, you pretty much drafted our briefing. Could you just explain a little bit about what environmental net gain is then?
Sure. So for me, it's around enhancing all of the elements of environmental quality, looking at our green infrastructure, our natural capital, our assets, and maximising those assets to deliver the ecosystem services, as many ecosystem services, and those ecosystem services in as healthy a state as possible. So it's rather than only focusing on biodiversity, saying, well, we're achieving the biodiversity. Can we make sure that that is flood attenuating to its maximum capacity, carbon sequestering to its capacity, and also within that, I think it is important in certain areas that people are also getting benefits from that, whether it's educational or recreational, health and mental well-being. So really, it's looking at everything very holistically and trying to maximise wherever we can.
That's great, thanks. Just so you mentioned biodiversity in there, there's been a lot, I mean, we've done a lot of work as CIEEM and others as well on biodiversity net gain. Claire, could you tell us a bit more about how environmental net gain builds on biodiversity net gain and perhaps the differences?
Sure. So biodiversity net gain, we are looking just at the living natural environment and benefits to it. In England, for example, this is being applied using a metric which is habitat focused. Environmental net gain, as Martina said, you're looking more widely, you're looking at all the ways the natural environment also benefits people. So flood alleviation, carbon capture, things like that. And at least in England, the way environmental net gain is envisaged to be applied is to make sure projects and approaches deliver that biodiversity net gain, and then look and see what can we add. So what other benefits can we deliver through that same intervention?
Thanks very much. Steph, how is environmental net gain, well, how is or is it intended to be implemented?
Okay. In terms of how it's implemented, it isn't implemented by a legal mandate in the way that biodiversity net gain will be from next year with the Environment Act. So it's a voluntary basis at the moment, and it's intended really to, to support decision making in the natural environment, to support decision making in development as to what would be the best way to optimize all of those different ecosystem services. So the tool that we're looking at the moment that's being used in England is called the EBN tool, the Environmental Benefit from Nature tool. The art is formerly known as the Ecometric, I think. And that's been released in beta version. So it's there. You can go onto the Ecosystem Knowledge Network's website and go and download the beta version, have a play around with it. They're also looking for people to volunteer with case studies to implement it. So it's really starting in very early and getting people used to working with all of this breadth of ecosystem services rather than just thinking about the biodiversity.
Thanks very much. Steph sort of touched on it, but Martina, do you have any idea of when this is coming in, or is it already happening?
I think it is happening, and I think clients are also driving some of the requirement for this, and we're obviously seeing the agricultural bill also bringing in environmental land management. So I think it's happening at many different levels. People are obviously driving this as well, because I think the pandemic has shown people just how important our open spaces are and the environment around us are and how it makes us feel. So I think it is already happening. In terms of a mandate, I don't know, but what we are seeing is there is in the NPPF a driver for environmental net gain within that policy. And we're seeing more and more local planning authorities again highlight that and drive that. So I think it is here now, and a bit like we were practicing biodiversity net gain a long time before that became mandated, from 2012 onwards. And we were seeing before any mandate came in place, people requesting it. I think that's the direction of travel for environmental net gain, that we will be doing it. And I think the mandate would potentially be relatively near in the future. It's got to be if we're going to keep our ecosystems in the condition that they need to be.
Seems odd with biodiversity net gain. We've been talking about it for so long, and that's still not actually mandated yet, is it? So yeah. We've talked a lot about England, DEFRA, the MPPF. Claire, is this happening in the other countries of the UK as well?
Absolutely. So biodiversity net gain, slightly different approaches, slightly different terminology, potentially in some areas different tools, but then environmental net gain, the drivers and the thinking is coming in slightly different ways. But actually, if you look, for example, in Wales, then we've had the legislation requiring reporting on maintaining the resilience of ecosystems for the last few years. And that's a slightly different way of looking at the same thing. But actually, that's about delivering for nature and for people. And I think in Wales, it's really interesting, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, that is absolutely looking at this, having ecosystems that function and deliver for ecology, for the natural environment, but also for people, for our society and for our economy, not just now, but for future generations. So actually you look back and think, that's what we were talking about, the very first definitions. What is sustainable development? Development that meets our needs without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own. So this isn't brand new thinking, it's different lenses, but it's stuff that's vital, and there are the drivers there to bring it in where people want to.
That's great, thank you. Steph, are there risks with environmental net gain?
There are risks with everything, Jason. Yes, I think first of all, there's a risk of confusion of terminology, particularly for non-specialists, for developers and sort of non-technical users of this, I think there is definitely a bit of a blurring of the boundaries, and people sometimes say environmental net gain when they mean biodiversity net gain and so on. So, and again, there've been a lot of metrics, the 3.0 version of the DEFRA BNG metric, the small sites metric, the EBN. So there's been a lot of things coming thick and fast, and I think there's a danger that people get confused and it gets lost in what's really going on. So I think there's that. But mostly, I think what worries me, and I think what's come out through our principles that we've produced at CIEEM for this, is that when we start to quantify all of these ecosystem services and understand, the losses and gains of different benefits through development or through other interventions, people start to feel that they're tradable. And I think it's really important that we're alive to that. We understand that trade-offs will indeed sometimes have to be made. You can't build new houses that people desperately need to live in without taking up some land that could have been used for something else. But we're very aware of it. We look at what good looks like. We look at what's right for that particular site, and we never lose sight of that first principle in our guidelines that, biodiversity net gain comes first. You have to have a net gain for biodiversity and build this out on top of it.
That's great, thanks. Claire or Martina, did you want to add anything with that one? Around risks?
I think that thing about the risk of being pulled in different directions. So we're still, as a country, getting our head round in England what delivering biodiversity net gain really needs to look like. And the risk that now, if you start thinking environmental net gain, then you end up thinking, oh, well, we'll deliver all of these things on the same site. And is it the right site? Is it the right site for all of those? Are you actually going to do something that's a bit rubbish for everything, rather than delivering really well, delivering for the biodiversity net gain, but also the other opportunities that site in that location really lends it to?
Yeah, I agree. I think the risk in messaging, because I think one of the problems that we've had with biodiversity, natural capital, green infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure is in messaging. So we want to make sure that we kind of bring everyone along with us. So when people are starting to get a handle on BNG, then we message well, and events like this and the things that CIEEM and IMA and Syria are doing is brilliant to try and get that messaging across. So I think that is a risk.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask each of you this question, sort of just around how your own organisations are engaging with environmental net gain. Can we start with Martina?
Sure. I think what we're seeing now, which is brilliant, is that previously it was sort of ecology coming banging on the door of different sectors and saying, this is what we can do for you. We need to get in early. Now what is happening, which is wonderful, I think that messaging piece has kind of come to fruition from all of the different parties, and they're now coming to us very early on in any kind of tender procedure as well, and saying, what can we do to maximize these benefits, which is amazing. And it's such a sea change from where we were even maybe 5 years ago. So we are using a variety of tools. We're also trialing the ecometric as was, and using sort of different, also Syria's best tool. But I think the important thing is being in that conversation at the beginning, having things in the tender, giving us some space so that we can get in there and work with the different disciplines to, as Claire was saying, make sure that there isn't a slightly daft decision made, that we're making a good holistic decision.
And is that the ecology team, biodiversity team you're talking about there, where they're coming to early on, or a wider environmental team?
So I would say that we in ecology are still driving the environmental net gain piece, but we are working with sustainability. And the other thing is we're getting clients coming to us very early in terms of strategic land use and disposal. And now, as saying, actually, we want you to look at this before anybody else gets to it, to give us that headline, so that we're not maybe having to retrofit things into other decisions that have been made. So I would say that while I think a lot of it sits with ecology, we're obviously working with our landscape team and our sustainability team and our EIA team, etc., to sort of make this into reality. But we're seeing people coming very early now and saying, I've got this land, what do I do with it? Which is fantastic.
That's great, thanks. Claire, how is Atkins engaging with ENG?
I think a lot of it's about upskilling and sharing knowledge. So for the people who aren't themselves working directly on the environment and ecology topics, there's suddenly a lot of new things they need to think about and help their clients get their head around. So actually helping those colleagues understand it. Among the ecologists, there's upskilling going on around actually just the new survey methods for biodiversity net gain, and it all ties in with this. And we've got a group who focus on natural capital valuation, and what's interesting is for quite a few years that valuation work was sort of running in parallel but not linked in with biodiversity work. And I was staring at this and talking with colleagues and thinking, why are these not clicking together? Because it's looking at the same thing in different lenses. And in the last couple of years, that's changed. And we've had clients who've been bringing that together. I'm also finding the client conversations are changing because there's new awareness in different groups. So the water industry, I don't know about the others, but I know our colleagues have found that many of the water companies are very aware to natural capital thinking, and therefore that concept of environmental net gain. And I think it's because they're one of the beneficiaries. You clean up the water quality, they're actually the beneficiary to that. So they're open to this wide thinking and bringing biodiversity into it. A lot of other types of clients, they've come a long, long time of just thinking environment is a constraint. Environment is the problem that I have to work around to develop my project. And now suddenly saying it's the solution to aspects of your project and to your project delivering for other problems as well. It's quite a thing for people to get their head around. So upskilling, but also around new ways of thinking, new conversations.
Okay, thank you. Steph, with your many hats on, how are you engaging with environmental net gain?
Okay. Well, with my main hat on, the hat that pays me at Nature Positive, I guess we come at it from a slightly different place than everybody else because we don't tend to work on projects. As such, we tend to work with organisations and looking at their whole interaction with the natural environment. So I spend most of my life going into boardrooms and saying, it's not about net zero. You can get to net zero by balancing an equation quite easily. It won't make you sustainable. And that you have to think as an organisation across all of these disciplines. So that the environmental net gain thinking is really great from my perspective because it's starting to open up that conversation about, your impacts on the environment is so much more than carbon, or there's so much more than a sort of narrow focus on biodiversity in a project. So for me, it's getting people to think about all the ways that they either impact on or indeed rely on the natural environment to carry out their business, and to get them to think about that, not just about what happens within the factory gate, but what happens up and down their entire value chain. So where do your raw materials come from? What do people do with your product or service at the end of the day, or its packaging? And so getting people to think in those big systems terms, the way that as ecologists we're all used to dealing with interrelations and complex systems. And I think that bringing that way of thinking into how organisations are being more sustainable is hugely important, particularly as we're coming up to the COPs.
Thank you. Claire, if we go back to the sort of how, stepping outside of the individual organisations, how are individual ecologists and environmental managers going to engage with environmental net gain more broadly then?
Sure. So I think, to be frank, everyone who's dialed in is doing exactly the right thing. It's about being curious and also not panicking. This isn't saying suddenly ecologists need to understand flood compensation, carbon calculations, all of these things. But it's about learning. It's about always being interested. And actually, I think ecologists are really well placed to do this, because you can't be an ecologist and think, that's it, I've learned everything, books closed, get on with the job. Everything's changing around us. You know, new species of bats turn up in the country, are found to exist. We didn't know. We're constantly having to learn new stuff. So it's really interesting. So keep learning, have a look at the CIEEM information if people haven't already, but also talk to colleagues within your own company if it's multidisciplinary, or make new links. And be prepared while you're learning to help others learn. Because people like landscape architects, there's a lot of new stuff they're having to take on board at the same time. Master planners. Step changes in how people think about these things. So being part of the conversation and being active and being interested, there's some great opportunities to engage with stuff.
That's great, thanks. Steph or Martina, did you want to add anything to that around individual ecologists or environmental managers and how they can engage?
Yeah, if I could just add a kind of note of caution, I guess. This is really expanding the scope of practice. It's expanding what we do and what we're responsible for. And I agree entirely with Claire that, you know, we as ecologists are very well placed to be the sort of fulcrum around which all of this pivots. I really think ecology is the best discipline to manage this. But then I've said that about EIA in the past, and landscape architects disagree with me. But I do think that's right. We're there, we're central to it all. We understand how these things all interconnect. But don't let that tempt you into thinking you are a flood modeler or a coastal erosion expert or a social impact expert. You will need a lot of other specialists to fill in the pieces around you. You just can have a wider conceptual role in coordinating it all.
Thanks. Martina?
Oh, well said from both. I think, as Claire was also mentioning, just stay engaged with what's going on. There is a lot of material, though, I'll be honest. Even as somebody who works in this field, things move so quickly. You go on holiday for 2 weeks and a new tool's been invented, you know. So I think it is very dynamic. Hopefully within your organisation, you have someone that can kind of filter some of it. So I would suggest that, yeah, if you haven't, that you sort of nominate someone as like an ENG champion and say, can you filter what's going on and send me a little précis every month?
Great. Steph, if ecologists aren't going to become flood modelers or social scientists, are there particular skills or training that they should be looking at, though, to better engage with ENG?
Yeah, I think learning more about ecosystem services, learning more about natural capital, and again, not trying to be an economist, but actually getting more engaged with, you know, which is probably for most of us where we all started, the actual scientific discipline of ecology and understanding how ecosystems work. One of the downsides of what was otherwise a great benefit, this kind of formalizing of how we go about doing ecological consultancy, the setting up guidelines and ways of working and methods, it made people do a lot of stuff right, but in some ways it took away the thinking. It took away the having to work it out from first principles of understanding ecological processes. And I think that's what this puts back. It puts back a little bit of intellectual rigor into the profession. It puts back a little bit of being able to use your own insight to deliver best practice rather than following a best practice guideline slavishly. So I think that's going to be a real opportunity for people who have a kind of, you know, an intellectual interest and a real desire to think about new ways of doing things.
Thanks. Claire or Martina, was there anything on skills and training you wanted to add to that?
I think it's, you know, what CIEEM is doing is fantastic, because it is a big ask. Probably don't try and do it all at once. It's another thing. But if you are working with a particular sector, each sector needs and how different organisations apply this will be very different. So it may be that you build a relationship with a particular sector or organisation and find out what environmental net gain means to them as a way of kind of breaking it down a little bit, perhaps.
Thanks. Claire?
Just a quick plug, actually. There's a website and organisation called the Ecosystem Knowledge Network, and they do an update email on the latest, what's going on, and obviously it's free. It's a good thing to sign up for, just for people to start to get their head around this. But yes, absolutely, that thing about read up around natural capital and ecosystem services, and don't pretend that you know everything, and don't feel you have to know everything. We've got all of these amazing colleagues who have got so much depth of knowledge in things that we're now just dipping into, and think how annoying it is when somebody else does the ecology bit as well as their own, and you think, no, you've done, this is so superficial, you don't know what you're doing. That's what it's like when we step into their areas as well. So just be aware that there's so much expertise there to tap into, but also we are coming to new areas where we suddenly find, you go and ask and the answer is, oh, actually there isn't an answer to that question, and suddenly we're having to work together. And you're looking at some of these questions thinking, why weren't we looking at this already? They're so obvious. You know, what does it mean for carbon when we make this habitat change? How do we not know that?
Okay, thanks. I think we've answered this question to some extent, but Martina, maybe you can add a little bit to it. But what are the opportunities with environmental net gain for the sector as a whole, for our sector, ecology and environmental management?
I think it's the most exciting time to be an ecologist or environmental manager, because I mentioned before about us now getting a real seat at the table early on. Claire touched on it earlier. We have been seen as a constraints industry. What can I not do? There is really, now is the time to completely transform that conversation, moving into an advisory space where we are helping businesses maximise their opportunities and minimise their risks. Now, hopefully that will actually result in a driving up of ecology salaries. And let's be honest, nobody goes into our profession for the money, for the bucks. But I think that that is something that, you know, will change when we're perceived as being someone that is contributing to sort of financial success of companies. I think that we will be able to work in many different fields as well. Like I touched on, lots of sectors employ this, these methods and what it means to them very differently. And as Steph was saying, with Nature Positive, by moving along supply chain, it gives us a thinking, well, where in the world are those products coming from that we are actually using in the UK? So while being mindful, to Claire's warning, not to overstretch oneself, I think it really opens up the global environment for ecologists to be involved. So I think it will mean more jobs, slightly, hopefully more respect in the industry, and ultimately a bit more pay. So hopefully.
Thanks very much. Steph or Claire, did you want to add anything to that?
I agree entirely with what Martina said, and I think the only thing I would add to it around respect and recognition for the profession is something that at CIEEM we've been looking at and talking about for a little while, which is around ecology and environmental management as a regulated profession. So you can't just hang a sign up and decide you're an ecologist. And I think a wider recognition of what we do and how important that is to society will really help us with that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Claire, did you want to add anything on opportunities?
The traditional, oh no, I'm on mute moment. Apologies for that. Yeah, it's a lot of new interesting things, but it's also it's just being careful that we don't lose sight. In the same way that when we look at biodiversity net gain, it's a blunt tool using a metric. There's all the subtleties, you know, all of the rare species, the really unusual habitats that it won't work for, so it runs alongside what we've been doing already. So it's not thinking this is the magic new approach that somehow means what we've been doing up till now is wrong. It's adding to it and refining it. And it's that ecological common sense of, is this the right thing for this site? Is this going to work? Am I saying, let's create this amazing wetland, but actually it's not going to have the water coming in. It's not going to work. So making sure that we step back and look at those ecological basics that we, as an industry, we know so well, and we don't forget them when we're looking at the sort of shiny new approaches and ways of looking at things.
That's great, thanks. Just a reminder to the audience, to listeners, if you have any questions for the panel, please do pop those in the Q&A function, and we'll come to those. Claire, you've kind of just covered this in a way, but are there other barriers to the sort of meaningful implementation of environmental net gain?
I think knowledge and money. If you look at, a lot of these are going to come through planning decisions, and local authorities, so many do not have an in-house ecologist. And those that do know a lot about this stuff, because you'll find they're the ecologist, but they're also the flood advisor, and probably have a couple of other hats as well. So these are new things that are going to come in. How are people going to know that the decisions on individual projects are being made robustly and based on the right information? So funding to get the people in place and support that decision-making process. Costs and decisions about how money is spent. This is different from business as usual. And for the major projects, the funding mechanisms, the decisions on money are made on a business as usual basis. So, and actually that's where I think the natural capital valuation system, I hope, will help with filtering in and making those decisions. And also the knowledge, you think a lot of this is about how land is used. We're asking landowners to make big long-term decisions. And if that's a developer buying land, then that's in the developer's gift. But if you're going to an individual landowner, whether it's a massive organization or a corporate or an individual family who've been looking after that farmland for generations, then we're asking them to make commitments. And is it the right thing to do with that land? How are they going to have that management funded in a few decades' time? And how does it all tie in with the agricultural funding system? That's changing at the same time as well. So it's an exciting time, but there's quite a pathway for the people making decisions to unpick, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And that thing about landowners, ecosystem services, the benefits of public health, that's so valuable. But we're dealing with real people who are looking after that landscape as well. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to unpick there, but it's going to be interesting to be part of it.
And of course, all of those processes are going to be different in the different UK countries as well. So,
absolutely, yeah, yes.
More to think about. Martina and Steph, do you want to add anything on barriers to implementation?
I think risk perception is one of them, and I am a big fan of just doing things. You know, a bit like first do no harm, but if there's something small that one can do, just do it. And for some reason that there is a real fear around maintenance. So maintenance of green infrastructure is a real barrier. We are now more and more aware of the funding mechanisms. There are different funding mechanisms. One of the conversations at the moment that is happening, which I do think is a risk, is around the stackability of benefits, with differing opinions on whether, for example, you have a piece of land that you have put forth a biodiversity net gain, can you claim carbon credits on it? I personally am a fan for stackability when it's demonstrated. And then because we want people to maximise that land, and for them to do that, I do think there needs to be an incentive to be able to keep it in long-term management. So I think sort of risks of uncertainty and the long-term management, I think, are some issues.
Thanks. Steph?
Yeah, I would probably, with my policy hat on, say that the lack of policy driving the ENG approach is a potential barrier. I mean, it is there in policy. It's been there since the 25-year environment plan, but it's not mandated anywhere. And we all know how patchily biodiversity net gain was implemented in different regions when that just existed in the NPPF. So I think we need to work hard to make sure that people understand the value of this way of thinking, and we need to get the educational piece out there to make sure that local authorities understand it and can build it into their local policy making and how they designate land.
Okay, thanks. Martina, what are the next steps? What happens next with environmental net gain?
Well, I'm hoping all of the practitioners are going to go out and give it a shot. And you can apply the principles at any stage in the project. So you can do this strategically with the landowners, or you can maximise through the design if you're involved in actually a project, a capital project. And then there is that the funding and legacy piece. There are clients that have a lot of land. We can make a very big difference on changing the management of it. So I would hope that all of the practitioners are going to, on every single project they have, they can say, what can I do in this project? And you can start off small. So you can qualify benefits, which is really just listing out what you think are the environmental elements that will diminish or improve due to your scheme and what you want to maximise. And then you can look at quantification, whether that is on carbon sequestration or water attenuation. And then, when things become more mature, you can monetize. In a bit of a plug for the briefing document, it does list a lot of standards and frameworks that you can use. There are a lot of tools, as well as the formerly known ecometric, the environmental benefits of nature tool. That's emerging, I think, as the one which will be used going forward. So it's definitely worth having a look at that. But if that's something that you think at the moment, that's not quite right for my project, there is Syria's BEST tool, there is iTree for arboriculturists out there. And like I said, then there's just a checklist, which sometimes gets things on the table. If, for example, there's a piece of land that will no longer be available for access, it's about thinking, well, how did people use that piece of land previously? What can the project do to make sure that they're not going to suffer due to that loss? So some of it's just about having those conversations. So I would hope that practitioners are going to get stuck in. Clients are definitely asking for it. The trialing of those tools and more evidence and sharing, like Claire was saying, our knowledge sharing, whether it's our slight mistakes or successes. We never like sharing our mistakes, but just saying, well, I tried this. I mean, there's things I did back in sort of 2015 and 2016 that if I look at them now, I would do them a completely different way. But at the time, I think they were the best outcome, for the scheme. So yeah, hopefully people will get stuck in.
That's great. Steph and Claire, anything to add on where environmental net gain is going next?
I think the only thing I would add to that is to make sure we're engaging with international approaches. There's a lot of work going on around the world on different approaches to natural capital, to biodiversity net gain, to environmental net gain, to environmental footprinting, and it's so hard to keep on top of these things, as Martina's already articulated. But I think looking for the organisations that are linking these things up, like Business for Nature, trying to sort of make sure that you're keeping abreast of what's happening and gaining, you know, not reinventing the wheel, but gaining the benefits of things that people have tried. You know, maybe they've tried it in South Africa or in Brazil, but it might well be applicable to your project.
Claire?
I think something it could be good for people to do is actually look at the project you've already done and think, where have we actually been doing this already? Because that can be really good if you're talking to a client and this is all just new and bewildering to them. But if you look at some of the established examples where we didn't use this terminology, but actually you can look back and say, look, this scheme, the Environment Agency's MEDMORI is a good example where that was actually funded based on standard flood risk funding models. And I was involved in an interesting study where we look back using an existing service valuation approach, so natural capital valuation, and found the benefits were actually way, way bigger than the standard modelling showed. But actually, that's a great example because you'd be looking at it thinking, well, agricultural land loss, that's a loss to people, but it's creating massive flood risk protection, new nature reserves, so great for wildlife and great for recreation for people, and the various other benefits. But it wasn't thought about through that lens when it was designed. It was just people who knew what they were doing saying, well, this can benefit people and it can benefit wildlife, while doing the right and being the right approach for flood defence for a particular community. So you probably find when you look back, and as Martina said, and Steph, there were things you look back and think, well, we'd have done it differently if we'd had this wider lens. But celebrate the successes we've already got, because it will build that confidence that this is something that can be deliverable and it's not weird. It's common sense.
Thank you. Steph, with your chair of CIEEM Strategic Policy Panel hat on, do you want to say something about what CIEEM's plans are next on environmental net gain?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we definitely want to continue learning and developing practice in this area. We want to, this webinar is really the first step in sort of opening up and starting to help with training opportunities for members in this field. The next sort of stage of development of our thoughts and principles on it relate to how it fits in with environmental impact assessment, because as yet it's not necessarily taken into account very well in EIA, but it's a hugely important aspect of it that cuts across all of the disciplines within EIA potentially. So that's an element where we're going to be working on some best practice with other partner organisations over the coming months. And then really, I think it fits in with our approach to the COPs that are happening later this year. Obviously, COP15, I think we're having the opening ceremony as planned in October, but the main part of the decision making is happening in next April, May time, and COP26 in Glasgow in November. The objectives that are coming out of those, the agreements that will be signed at those international congresses are hugely challenging. They're talking that to reverse the decline in biodiversity by 2030, that's like 8 years from when it's signed. We're talking about massive transformational system change. We're not talking about doing what we do now and a little bit more. Let's carry on with society as we do now and designate a few more nature reserves. That really won't deliver those agreements. So if governments around the world have any intention of really delivering on the agreements they're planning on signing in November and next May, then there will be a massive transformation in development, in how businesses run, in how governments operate, and very much in our profession. And I think environmental net gain and looking across these broader issues of how society interacts with the natural environment, how we depend on it, how we impact on it, and how we can regenerate it, are going to be questions that underpin all aspects of society. So I think it's something that we as an institute need to keep at the forefront of, to make sure that our members are really up to date, are knowledgeable and informed, and are competent to deliver the kinds of analyses that are going to be needed to make these huge transformational shifts.
Thanks very much, Steph. We haven't got any questions from the audience, so we'll probably wrap up a little bit early. I just wanted to give the floor then to each of you three. If there was anything final you wanted to say, should we start with Claire?
Hello. So yeah, just to the listeners, seriously, it's brilliant that you've joined this call, because this is so important that it's going to be a key conversation going forward. But keep engaged, keep learning. Biodiversity net gain, we've still got to get that embedded and done well. And this is the next step. And we've got to stay engaged in this conversation, because actually if we don't, what we will find is somebody else will take it away from us and will run with it. And then we will be looking back in a few years and find that it has become some sort of trading thing where biodiversity is just one piece. And obviously you think, well, yeah, you're an ecologist, you would say that's the most important. But the bottom line is we're living in a time of climate change emergency and a biodiversity emergency. And those both need fixing for the benefit. Forget about wildlife for a moment. Our species needs those things fixed, or we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So make sure that we're keeping that conversation. I've just noticed actually something pinged up on the Q&A.
Q&A has pinged up, yes. So it says, do you suggest any new courses? I'm assuming they're talking about training courses. So if anyone has any suggestions for training courses.
I think the Ecosystem Knowledge Network do run quite a few webinars and courses as well. So I think, like Claire said, keeping an eye on that would be a great thing to do. But there are a huge amount of resources out there. There's the Natural Capital Protocol. There are, more, as Steph was saying, global, the World Resources Institute. There are vast amounts of sources. I think some of them are in that briefing note that we had, but what we could do if people were interested is perhaps put together a list of sources and things that they could look to as an output of this.
Okay.
I think it would also be great if people have particular aspects that they think it would be good for CIEEM to run a course on, then let us know where the demand is, and we can look at whether we can deliver those courses. It's much easier to deliver courses now that we're doing a lot of this kind of thing virtually. But yeah, whether you're looking at, how to use some of the metrics and techniques, whether, a little further down the line, how could I apply this to EIA, or even, how can I apply this to my own organization? So, by all means, give us some feedback and tell us the sort of things that you think would be useful.
Absolutely. Thanks. Martina, closing statement as it is.
Well, for me, all my sort of life and career, academic and professional, biodiversity has been the thing that underpins our resilience, our sustainability and our productivity, in this world. And I do think the time is now, and I've been saying it for a long time, that ecologists and environmental managers will inherit the earth. I do think the time is now. And as Steph and Claire have been saying, we really matter. So I think go back to whatever you're working on and see how you can integrate environmental net gain into it. And, again, let us know how you get on.
Great. Steph, a final word from you.
Well, really only to echo what Martina and Claire have said around just getting stuck in. I like the idea of asking for forgiveness, not permission. So get stuck in and do some environmental net gain on your project and see how it turns out. And use it to open a conversation with your client, perhaps, around, well, look at this. We think we're doing the right thing, but actually, if we look at it from a wider perspective, we're good for this, but we're not so good for that. And use it yourselves as a design tool and a way of thinking about maximizing the benefits and minimizing the impacts on the natural environment. think about it in your own life if you like to. Think about it, use it to measure some of your buying decisions. There are a lot of different ways that you can apply this style of thinking and use it, you know, to put pressure on policymakers and on major companies for the choices they give us in environmental terms.
That's great. Thank you very much. So thanks to all the panel. So just a quick reminder then, so we based today's discussion around the briefing paper that we wrote and the principles. So they're both available on the CIEEM Resource Hub if you go onto the website. And as I said, if you select environmental net gain from the topics, that'll bring those up. Someone also mentioned or asked in the questions around the resource, the newsletter that Claire mentioned. So that's the Ecosystems Knowledge Network, the EKN. They do a free newsletter. So if you wanted to sign up to that, please go and have a look for them. And then Steph also mentioned, if there are training needs that you are interested in, please do let us know. We're always updating and always looking at the training program at CIEEM. So if there are particular areas of this that you are interested in, let us know and we can look into those. And then just to wrap up, just say thanks very much for attending. So we have recorded today's episode. It will go onto YouTube, it'll go onto our resource hub, so you'll be able to find it there, hopefully in the next couple of days. As I mentioned previously, September's edition will be looking to the future, to the next generation as part of our 30th anniversary celebration. So we'll be talking to some young ecologists about where they're going the next 30 years. That'll be available to book shortly, so keep an eye out on the newsletter and social media for that. And then just lastly, thank you very much to the panel for coming together today, and thank you very much to you for joining us as listeners and the audience. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.